Well, hello, everyone. My name is Richard Hamlin, and I'm the head of the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences at UBC Faculty of Forestry. I am a forest pathologist. I study tree diseases, and my research focuses on genomics and the use of genomics to develop diagnostic and monitoring tools. But today, I'm delighted to be your host and your moderator for our virtual program this afternoon. The program, of course, is Urban Tree Trouble: Insights from Stanley Park. Now, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and the UBC Okanagan campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Now, for millennia, these sites have been places of learning and ceremony, where cultures, histories, and traditions are passed on from one generation to the next. And it is very much in that spirit that we are gathered here today. I would also like to recognize that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and I would encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. By doing so, we are reminded that Canada's legacy of colonization continues into the present, and that all of us have an obligation to advance decolonization in this country and to make meaningful progress on the 94 calls to action set forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Now, on behalf of the Faculty of Forestry and alumni UBC, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you in advance for helping to create a respectful and inclusive environment for all of our speakers, volunteers, and audience members. Now, today's program is made possible by the presenting partners of Forward, the campaign for UBC, including CBC Vancouver and the Globe and Mail. Now, Forward, the campaign for UBC, is the biggest fundraising and alumni engagement campaign in UBC's history. With the support of alumni, donors, and friends like all of us joining today, UBC is advancing healthy lives, a healthy planet, healthy societies, while addressing the immediate affordability needs of UBC students. Now, today's conversation is representative of one of the many ways that UBC is undertaking research to help create a healthier planet. Now, I'm super happy today to be here to moderate the conversation with UBC alumni Bruce Blackwell and Joe McLeod. They will be sharing their insights on the webinar topic, drawing from their vast experience in urban forestry planning and restoration in Vancouver, including Stanley Park. Now, after our conversation, we will be taking questions from our viewers using Slido. That's our online audience engagement platform. You can enter a question or vote for your favorite questions by going to slido.com and use our event code URBANTREE to sign in. You will see the instructions on the screen, and the link is also being shared in the chat right now. So feel free to start posting questions at slido.com with the event code URBANTREE. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our featured speakers, Bruce Blackwell and Joe McLeod. Bruce and Joe, please feel free to turn your cameras on while I provide a short introduction.
You're on, Richard.
Morning.
All right. Nice to see you. So two-time forestry alum Bruce Blackwell is principal of B.A. Blackwell and Associates. Bruce has 36 years of experience as a professional forester and biologist, and he founded B.A. Blackwell and Associates in 1988. And Blackwell specializes in integrated forestry and environmental consulting. Now, Bruce has contributed to strategic planning for Vancouver's urban forests and the restoration of Stanley Park. So welcome, Bruce. Now, let me introduce UBC Forestry alum Joe McLeod, an ISA certified arborist and associate director of urban forestry and specialty parks at the City of Vancouver. Now, in that role, using over 20 years of professional expertise, Joe oversees decision-making related to sustainable urban forest management, balancing priorities such as risk management, ecological restoration, political commitments, and implementation of bylaws and policies. Welcome both Joe and Bruce.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Morning.
All right. So the starting point for today's discussion, of course, is the challenges and strategies in managing urban green spaces amidst the growing demands and pressure, climate change, population growth, and then, pests like the looper moth that attacked the trees in Stanley Park. So that's what we want to discuss today. So before I start with the questions, I will remind you that I will start off the discussion with some of my own questions, sort of just to get the ball rolling, and open up the conversation then to viewer questions via Slido. Feel free to submit your questions. You can vote for the ones. If you see a question in there that's the question that you like the most, you can vote for it. You can also type your own questions. And we will go through the questions as long as we have time. And please use the website slido.com, and the event code is Urban Tree. All right, well, let's kick this off then. I've got some questions here that I want to ask. First, Bruce. So Bruce, your company has been involved in urban forestry planning, like I said, in introduction and restoration in Vancouver for many years, including that crazy storm in 2006 that toppled a whole bunch of trees, tens of thousands. And then there's this looper outbreak that you're in charge of now. So how different are these two big, dramatic events for you to manage? Can you compare and contrast like how it is to deal with these two events?
Yeah, it's a good question, Richard. The windstorm event was basically, it happened in a very short period of time, overnight essentially, and the damage was done largely within a 24-hour period. And the damage was basically trees that broke, snapped, or blew down at the root ball, and created an immediate hazard. Basically, there were trees blown onto roads, infrastructure, trails, etc., that needed to be cleared. And I guess there were overhead hazards that were mitigated, but also there was the concern about the accumulation of debris, and as we moved into fire season in the spring, whether that debris was a fire risk and the need to clean it up. So that was affected about 48 hectares of a 263 forested hectare park. The overall size of the park's 418, but the forested portion is about 236. The hemlock looper basically started killing trees in about 2019 on the North Shore, predominantly in the district of North Van, city of North Vancouver, West Van, and into Capilano watershed. And it moved relatively slowly after that first year into the northern portion of Stanley Park, mostly concentrated around a Lionsgate Bridge area. But then, for whatever reason, I mean, there are a number of reasons looper attacks trees, but certainly I think the drought that we had, the forest structure, and the amount of hemlock in the park contributed to the looper exponentially growing in population and heavily defoliating the north end and proceeding to defoliate the park southwardly to where it's largely, I think, finished the outbreak down towards Tatlow Trail and Lost Lagoon. But almost all of the park has some level of mortality, and that mortality varies by stand throughout the park. So essentially, there's some very high impact areas where more than 50% of the trees were killed, and there's some lower impact areas that were killed. So I think that's the most that describes what happened the most. I think what are the most important things that have been sort of considered in how to deal with this? First of all, once the looper trees have been killed, they immediately begin to decay and rot, and branchwood and topwood starts to fall in and around these trees. And even working there over the last year, we've had trees come down. We had a tree that almost took out an outhouse. So we expect that over time, this hazard of trees coming down onto the ground are going to be a significant hazard. The other part is once the trees get to the ground, they create a heavy fine fuel loading that not immediately, but over time becomes a significant fire hazard. And I think I want to set the record straight on a couple of points. There's been some miscommunication in the media. One of them is that the only trees that have been removed are trees that have been confirmed dead by the looper, or they had some defect that was classified as imminent as a hazard to public traveling through the park. And ultimately, the main reason for taking down trees at this point, and Joe will probably elaborate this more, is for public safety. Almost the entire park is a target for trees to fall on and impact human safety. So that's the most important part of why the trees are cutting down. And the areas that have been treated to date are really the highest priority. The causeway, which has a large number of cars traveling through it daily. We don't interrupt that traffic or threaten safety of people traveling. And the other areas are high traffic areas. And I think the other thing to understand is that there's a window of treatment that really is between October and March. And that's largely to facilitate not interrupting the breeding bird season. So we don't want to interrupt the breeding birds, which is by law important. So that kind of highlights other big differences between the windthrow is there has been a lot more First Nations considerations in the areas that have been impacted. So there have been several historic grave sites that were impacted. There are culturally modified trees that we have to protect. And there's a number of very important archaeological features. And we work closely with archaeologists. I think probably compared to the blowdown, that has been one of the biggest and most challenging issues that we faced.
And also, I guess, more social media, I think, now than there were in 2006, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the social media for sure has been a challenge. It's not always been accurate. In fact, it's been, in some cases, absolute misinformation. And I think people like yourself and others have commented from the scientific point of view of why things are happening. And I think that's the most important part, is that people understand that we're doing this for public safety, number one. And number two, these dead trees, we need to focus on how are we going to make this forest more resilient moving into the future after these trees have died. And I think I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel we were doing the right thing.
Right. Oh, by the way, these trees with defect, there's a lot of mistletoe, dwarf mistletoe also in the park, and that's also a point of entry for decay fungi. So that could explain why some of those trees were already decayed standing.
Absolutely. And I think there's a slide in the slide deck of some historic logging in the park, and that logging occurred prior to the park being dedicated. And that logging was, those were the events that allowed hemlock to regenerate, primarily because Douglas fir and cedar were the result of some level of fire disturbance, whether that was indigenous fire disturbance or whether it was natural fire disturbance. And so we converted through human activities a lot of this forest into regenerated hemlock forest, and there has historically been a lot of mistletoe associated with that regeneration. One of the main reasons we had such a prolific blowdown event, and now we've got susceptibility to looper.
Yeah, nice pictures. Well, let me thanks for this, Bruce. Let me turn to Joe now for a question about the looper moth, and because that's what started everything, and I want to know, Joe, from your perspective, like, I mean, is this something that was on your radar screen? Did you expect something like this? And what is it that you do normally, or what is it that you do in Stanley Park or any kind of green space when you have pest infestation? Because looper moth is just one of them. There's many diseases and insects attacking trees. And so what is it that you do at the city for those events?
Thanks, Richard. So yeah, with respect to the hemlock looper outbreak in Stanley Park, I will say it was on our radar, but only insofar as the more kind of historic behavior of the insect. Historically, it's been an ephemeral insect affecting forest areas on about a 15-year basis, and only affecting those areas for 1 to 2 years. But I think with the climate change we've seen and some of the hot, dry summers, having 4 years, of that outbreak, year over year over year, it's more of it's a level of devastation in Stanley Park that's beyond what we've historically seen. There's some of the historical documents that we have on hand here at the city show that there was outbreaks, all the way back to the 20s, 30s. The management of the insect at that time was very different. I've got one document that says the city decided to spray the whole park with lead arsenate to deal with the insect, which fortunately we don't use those techniques anymore. But I mean, yeah, it's something that's ongoing, in terms of monitoring, not only in Stanley Park, but all of our parks. We have an obligation, per the tree risk inspection policy to inspect our trees on an annual basis and our forest areas. So there's several insects currently affecting our parks. We've got everything from emerald ash borer, which was recently found in the city.
Yep,
we've got other insects like bronze-headed birch borer that are have targeted birches here for many years. Japanese beetle is currently being managed, and all of these insects we generally work closely with the CFIA, especially when it comes to insects that also transfer over to affect agricultural crops. So it's definitely an ongoing program that we run here.
Yeah. So you mentioned this lead arsenate. I mean, this was a different era, of course, when you would spray that in a park. But now there's much safer products. There's biopesticides like BT, for example. Was that ever an option, or is it ever an option in Stanley Park or any other park of the city to use a biopesticide for managing a pest outbreak?
I mean, one of the biopesticides that's currently on the market is BTK, and that has been used to treat looper populations. As Bruce mentioned, the district of North Vancouver, they experienced the outbreak, slightly before city of Vancouver. They elected not to treat with biopesticides, and the city of Vancouver followed suit in the sense that it's a non-target pesticide, meaning it not only would affect the looper insect, but it would essentially affect all Lepidoptera genus, or essentially beneficial moths and butterflies as well. So it's a bit of a dangerous territory to go down in terms of ecosystem management, but also it's a bit of a lightning rod, right, when you start wiping out entire butterfly and moth populations. And I think Bruce is aware of some litigation that's being acted on some other municipalities in the province that have used the biopesticide, but community members are pushing back. So it's contentious to say the least.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking there would have been a lot of protests if you'd been using a biopesticide in Stanley Park again in 2020, let's say, before it was really out of control. So it's easy to say in retrospect, but I think that would have been dangerous territory to be in.
I mean, if I could add to, I think that when you get these populations that are out of balance, like Stanley Park was, in the sense that there was really an overrepresentation of hemlock as a species in Stanley Park.
That's right.
And so it was really ripe for kind of a balancing, so to speak. So as much as it's been, there's been a lot of tree mortality because of the hemlock looper, in many respects, it is an opportunity to kind of rebalance the ecology and find a more kind of resilient species mix in Stanley Park moving forward.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Joe. Bruce, I'm going to go back to you and ask you to just tell me about what goes into consideration when you go into like management of an urban forest like Stanley Park, or any really other large urban forests? And what's top of your mind? What are the top things that you need to consider when you go into these actions?
Well, I think I already mentioned it, Richard, that the public safety is number one. But Stanley Park is a native forest, and there are a lot of other considerations. It's been heavily impacted by invasive species, as have many green spaces in the Lower Mainland and abroad. So invasive species is big. There have been numerous fire ignitions that fortunately have not resulted in large fires in Stanley Park, but have been started and extinguished relatively quickly by Vancouver Fire Rescue. You have the issue of a changing climate, certainly the drought, the heat dome, and some of these kind of events add stress to the forest canopy. Another big one for us was looking at red and blue listed ecosystems within the park. So there are rare and endangered ecosystems, and one of the red listed species is the western shrew, and that's something that had to be considered extensively during the blowdown operations. We were removing a lot of trees in some of its habitat. A lot of people don't know that Stanley Park is gifted to the city as a lease owned by the federal government. Joe could elaborate it better than I. So we had to comply with the Federal Species Act in terms of that. Other complexities, some of the there's some important features around water courses within the park that couldn't be treated this last winter because we had to do more archaeological work and potentially install a temporary bridge to avoid impacting those areas. So, I think those are the technical forest management complexities, but then that's compounded by the social side of things going on in the park. We had a lot of disruption from people not wanting to be stopped in traffic. We had some of our staff abused by the public. There was someone that jumped off the bridge in front of the crew. There's social things that you don't have happen in a normal forest environment that you have to deal with in a big urban environment. And this adds a tremendous amount of complexity to how you can do the work, when you can do the work, and the way you do the work. So all of this had to be carefully planned, working in concert with city staff. I would say our team was in constant communication with city staff, and I think we developed a very good seamless rapport in terms of how to deal with all of these complexities. And I was talking to somebody at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and they asked me, so how do you look at this project? And I said, it's probably the most complicated project I've ever been involved in the 38 years that I've been practicing forestry. And I have been in quite a few complicated ones, I must say.
Yeah, there's actually people living in Stanley Park, right?
Yes. We cleaned up a fairly large encampment that was abandoned. And there was an individual, well, there were several individuals that are living there daily. They move, they don't stay in the same place, but they're there. And certainly you're bringing in large equipment, you're falling trees, there's a big consideration.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Now, Joe, the projection for the city of Vancouver is that we're going to get a lot more people moving into Vancouver. We're talking about 1 million residents added by 2050. I don't know if that keeps you up at night, but what's on your top of your radar to manage the green spaces in the city to accommodate all of those people? So it's basically going to be a lot more people using, these parks. And what does it mean for you in terms of managing those green spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it does keep me up at night, I would say. I think, I think with a finite number of green spaces in the city of Vancouver, parks some new parks are being created, but it's definitely the exception and not the rule. So that puts a lot more pressure on the green spaces in the city of Vancouver, and I think for any municipalities for that matter. So with respect to Stanley Park, there's I think the number is 70,000 cars go through Stanley Park every day, coming to and from the city over the Lions Gate Bridge. So, I mean, that's why the causeway was the top of the list in terms of areas that we are treating to remove dead trees. And Stanley Park alone receives, 18 million visitors annually, which is a huge number. And to Bruce's earlier point about why that, the primary work window is respecting nesting season, it also, the added benefit of that is that it also respects the tourist season, because peak tourism really starts in April and goes right through till Labor Day. So it's the amount of pressure on the park is immense. And I think that, one thing that I can kind of anecdotally share is when I first visited Stanley Park in 1996, it was a lot more of a, I wouldn't say it was a pristine ecosystem, but it was definitely more of a reflection of the regional kind of native ecosystems that you would expect around the Lower Mainland. And now it's very different, right? It's there's a ton of invasive species that are affecting Stanley Park. There's there's primary trails, but then there's secondary and tertiary trails that are and to the point about the encampments, like there's definitely more unhoused that are occupying parts of Stanley Park. There's those that have said, oh, well, a wildfire risk in Stanley Park isn't really a thing. And the fact of the matter is, I believe in the month of June last year, there was 39 fires put out by the park rangers. And that's everything from, errant cigarettes being, flicked into the understory to people, having cook stoves going that get out of control, or fires for that matter. So there's always people using the parks in the city of Vancouver, and Stanley Park, because it is a bit more of a, quote unquote wild space. There's more kind of nooks and crannies for people to occupy and use. And that is what concerns us, because areas that weren't necessarily being managed for public safety now do have to be managed for public safety more and more, because there's dead trees that historically would be left for wildlife purposes, but now when there's people constantly walking through those areas, we have to be mindful of that. So it's tricky kind of finding that optimum balance between ecosystem health, aesthetics, risk management, public safety, and then you throw climate change into the mix, where we're seeing certain species that are just not performing the way they historically have. And it's definitely a dynamic situation, like any forest management.
Certainly climate change is the big black box there of what's going to happen to the trees, and also how the stress on the trees will impact their ability to resist attack by pests and pathogen. I would think that's going to be a biggie going forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Joe. So Bruce, back to you. How do we build resilience while you do the restoration of Stanley Park? How do we sort of make sure that we have a more resilient Stanley Park in the future? Like, how do you build resilience into it?
So I think we've spoken about it broadly, that a lot of hemlock is regenerated in there naturally over time. We're removing that hemlock, and it's being replaced by Douglas fir, cedar. We have a component of Sitka spruce, which was in the park, alder. So some deciduous has been replanted. And the First Nations requested that we incorporate Taxus bravofolia as a component of some of the planting. So I think the total number is 25,000 seedlings have been planted across the 67 hectares that have been treated this past year. We do have a number of monumental cedars and Douglas fir in the park that really set the example of the vision we want to try and achieve in this resiliency strategy. Fortunately, we didn't lose Douglas fir or cedar. I mean, both of them were affected by the looper moth. They have had some defoliation, but the goal in terms of removals has been to not impact those monumental cedars and those large older Douglas firs. And I think we've been successful as a team in protecting those trees. So the goal is to see the park managed, that we can one day look at, more these new young cedars and firs will grow up to become these monumental species that really inhabited a large part of the Lower Mainland and the Fraser Valley. And we're planting with tree species that are within the provenance, within the biogeoclimatic zone that's appropriate. So these are trees that are selected appropriately within the zones that they should be planted, and they're species that are native to the park and were there historically. So we expect, if we can tend these trees, manage the density, manage the invasives and the human pressures, because even walking in some of the forest areas, some of these trees' root bases are sensitive to human traffic. There's management required into the future, and there'll be management to remove brush to allow these trees to establish. There'll probably be some thinning because the numbers are high to achieve a stand structure that we have the option to thin. And we'll continue to try and manage invasives. The plantations that have been established cannot just be left and walked away from. There is some forest management that will be required to meet the objectives and goals of what ideally would be the stand structure that we're trying to achieve.
But I mean, you mentioned climate change. That's the big that's the big issue. One of the big issues going forward, maybe the biggest. And the species mix that you're putting in is, if we think 50 to 75 years from now, is that going to be the right mix of species, or is climate change should make us think, we need to plant something different, even if it's counter to our, our normal instinct of planting what was there in the past?
So I think that's a really good question. The park is within the coastal western hemlock dry maritime. It's influenced by maritime climate. It's on the drier end of the maritime. We know the site series of the park, 07s, 05s, and really we've spent a lot of time managing the species and plantings to fall within, you want to grow cedar on the moistest sites, the 07s, the 05s. You want to grow fir on the drier side, and fir is quite tolerant to drought, and its range, I think both of those species are within a large natural range, and I don't think that, sorry, that's a fire. They're testing my fire alarm. I didn't know that.
Oh, no.
Maybe just go to Joe, but the bottom line is we believe we've accounted for climate change and what we're trying to achieve.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. Okay, while you take care of your fire alarm, Bruce. Another question, Joe. You mentioned it, but the First Nations. That's also a very important piece in what you do. So how do you engage with First Nation in your urban forest activities, and does that align with the city's conservation goals and reconciliation goals? Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So the city of Vancouver, they've signed on to the UNDRIP principles, and they've been pursuing some of the key work and kind of tip of the spear works, so to speak, as it relates to reconciliation. The park board team, typically when we have projects of this nature, we undergo a typical referral process, working closely with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This project in particular was brought to through the referral process. It was brought forward to MST, as we refer to them. And that was brought to them in July of 2022, prior to going out to market and initiating the procurement process, where we brought on Bruce and his team. So that dialogue with our local host nations has been ongoing, and it's ranged everything from phone calls and emails and meetings to actual site meetings, where we've kind of gone through what the work plans are, what's happening as it relates to treatment and mitigation work, and also the restoration work what type of species are being planted, and um, a couple of key components as well is we have some in-house archaeologists that work on our team that have been working really closely with us and the consultant team to develop or co-develop kind of soft touch or low impact kind of operational processes in some of the archaeologically sensitive areas. So there's subsurface, archaeological assets that have to be accounted for. So that impacts everything from, how trees are planted to, whether we use, kind of, soft tires and different equipment on the ground, or even, lowering limbs and using soft touch kind of falling practices. And then, of course, the culturally modified trees that are within the park. We've been very mindful that that those are all accounted for and haven't been impacted through the work we're doing. And then finally, we've been sharing all of the Western red cedar and the Douglas fir with the local nations for cultural purposes, and then also providing much of the hemlock to the local nations for traditional burning and ceremony. So several that's coming in the form of loads of firewood, etc. And then any remaining hemlock that isn't really kind of in a position to be shared or is such that it's more merchantable, we've been sharing that with a log sort up in Squamish for use domestically. So I just want to kind of touch on some of the assertions that we're logging for profit, which is far from the truth. For the project as far as it's gone at this point, I think that there's only been approximately $30,000 in revenue that's accrued from log sales, which is a pittance relative to the overall work budget as it relates to risk mitigation work and whatnot. So, I mean, that relationship is ongoing though with our local nations, and we've been really pleased with how engaged they have been in terms of participating and contributing to the process. So yeah, ongoing.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, both Bruce and Joe. We are now ready to dive into the questions from the virtual participants. And I'm on Slido right now, and I'm looking at the questions. The top question actually is very much on the topic that we just talked about. So I'm just going to read it and see if, Joe, do you want to add anything, or even Bruce, if you want to pitch in. This question is the most highly voted, as you know, Slido. People vote for questions. This is the most highly voted. So, and the question is, how does Indigenous traditional knowledge inform urban forest planning? Maybe broader than just Stanley Park. It's me saying that, but so the sustainability of the neighborhood, including urban and peri-urban forests and biodiversity. So the role of, sorry, that was, oh, sorry. Let me read it again, because the questions flipped while I was reading it. So how does the Indigenous traditional knowledge from urban forest planning, how can it be better emphasized and included in green space development? So Joe, anything you want to add? Or
I mean, one of the pieces I will add is what we've gathered so far in terms of our dialogue with the nations is that generally there's a shared agreement that public safety is a concern for everybody, right? So it's in Stanley Park, for instance, it's not only safety of visitors to the park, but it's also safety of workers in the park, employees of the park board and the city of Vancouver, and also any Musqueam, Squamish to Tsleil-Waututh visitors to the park that are utilizing the park or visiting it for cultural purposes. They want these spaces to be safe. The city doesn't traditionally ask when it comes to mitigation of risks that are posing imminent risks to public safety. And I think generally they're in agreement of that. Now, when it comes to the traditional ecological knowledge piece, I think that's something that is an ongoing relationship. I think as we, my hope is that eventually we can move from the more formal referral process to a point where there's a built trust, and there's more, it's more of a collaborative, pick up the phone and be like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Or they can just come and knock on our door and say, hey, we've got some ideas we want to share. But I think the trust piece is huge. And I think that's not just in Vancouver. I think that's probably Canada wide, kind of transitioning from these more formalized processes to more of a more organic and spontaneous communication approach. But it takes both sides for sure. Bruce, you want to
thanks for that.
comment that?
No, I mean, I think, Joe, this project is involved more collaboration with First Nations than I've ever been involved with it. Largely because Stanley Park was a very important location for First Nations. There were numerous First Nations living within the park in different parts of the park, and their history there. I have to say I was relatively naive until we started in the windstorm in 2006, but I've become very aware that, there's some sacred burial grounds and other things that really have helped set objectives of how we need to address treating these areas, moving forward.
Thanks for that. I got the next most voted question. I like this one because it's something that I feel like a lot of people, you can tell how people love the park and people really care for the park. And that question, it just disappeared from Slido, sorry. Anyway, if I remember, the question is about the public and how can the public help? What can it do? What can the public do when you have, the type of event that we've had? So what role can the resident play in supporting this sustainability of their urban areas, their urban parks, their neighborhood, and even the peri-urban forests? Is there anything that the residents can do? And because you've seen, both of you have seen how much people care about Stanley Park. It becomes very personal, right?
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, certainly my experience has been the public contributes a lot in removal of invasives and managing invasives in their own backyards. And I think, Stanley Park has the Ecological Society that's been managing invasives. There's invasives in all of our green spaces all over the place. And it unless we get a contribution from the public, I don't think we have enough public funding to properly address the invasives to the level that we all desire. So I think from a volunteer point of view, these organized sessions by municipalities and local parks are one of the biggest ways publics can contribute to the management of parks. It'd
be good also, I mean, because there's so many eyes out there, it'd be good if people knew more how to recognize like the signs of insects and pests and in some of these invasive species, and because using apps like the iNaturalist, for example, and I think that could be a great input where people could contribute to do the surveillance of these spaces.
That's a great idea. I mean, I was just away this weekend using iMerlin trying to figure out what birds were around me. I mean, and it goes into a national database.
Exactly.
So I think these kinds of tools, the public could contribute a lot of information, a lot of knowledge that probably would drive more active management of these kind of issues.
Okay, our next most voted question here is regarding what are some of the strategies that can be either replicated or adapted to other parks around Canada, around the world? Can we sort of get lessons out of what happened here, and can we sort of share these lessons with every other city in the world, the how-tos and what not to do? Either Joe or Joe, you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I'll touch on it. I mean, I think I look at some of the proactive communications that we did on the impacts of looper in Stanley Park, and and I think, you know, that maybe didn't, maybe it was off of the radar. And I said this going back even a few years, that the benefit, if there was a benefit to the 2006 windstorm, was that it was a sudden overnight event. So it garnered national attention.
Right.
And it also garnered a lot of funding from, you know, very, you know, generous donors who said, hey, we want to help. Whereas because the hemlock looper outbreak, it was like this slow moving train that was coming towards us, and we knew it was coming, and it was getting closer and closer. But our proactive communications, they didn't really. It's hard to say. It's similar to climate change. It's like this, you know, climate change is coming. Beware. It's like, well, it's coming so slowly and faster as time goes on that I don't know. I guess our proactive communication probably could have been a bit more, I don't know, I don't want to say inflammatory, but a bit more the urgency around the nature of the problem. But I think the other piece of this is, from the city's perspective, is that the project didn't get attention until we had a professional report from a consultant. So I think as far as lessons learned, perhaps we should have hired a professional consultant as soon as we identified looper in Stanley Park, as opposed to monitoring it, which I think we got away with historically, because it would be a 1 to 2 year outbreak. But with climate change, all bets are off, right? It's and what maybe had worked in the past, it isn't necessarily going to work in the future. So, you know, as soon as we got an RPF stamp on that, on a report saying you have a problem, all of a sudden, you know, senior decision makers started to say, "Oh, did you say something?" It's like, yes, we I think we're trying to say this. So, anyways, that would be maybe a couple of take homes.
That's a good point. Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
I think from my perspective, and this is a little different than Joe's, is that society seems to think that green spaces, and you know this better than anyone, Richard, is that they're static. They don't change, and we can put fences around them, and they'll be like that in perpetuity. And if you've lived in British Columbia long enough, you know there was a mountain pine beetle outbreak. You know that fire is having broad effects on the landscape. And disturbance is a big part of our forest ecosystems in British Columbia. And I think it's a fallacy to think that we can manage these areas statically without some form of management. Now, I'm not suggesting they need to be logged. A lot of people are advocating that logging is the solution to fire, but insects and disease are going to continue into the future, and probably forest health is going to be under stress and strain more than it ever has. And so mortality of trees is not going away. So unless we, as stewards of the land, start thinking about how we're going to manage these events more proactively, they're going to be a big economic burden on our society going into the future. You know, Stanley Park, when you start looking at the cost to do this rehabilitation work, is enormous. And you know, these kind of things are not just happening in Stanley Park. We've done work in Lynn Headwaters Park. There's Capilano watershed that has potentially got issues. They're occurring all over the place. If you go to Kelowna in the interior, they've had similar events. So I think society has to be willing to more proactively manage these types of areas, and unless they're willing to accept big changes and damages like you've seen in Stanley Park. And Stanley Park is a microcosm of the province in terms of disturbance.
Yeah, I'd say if this outbreak, and I've said it in the past, if this outbreak hadn't been in Stanley Park in our backyard of the city of Vancouver, you know, if it had been 100 kilometers north, it'd probably be no big deal, because it's a native endemic insect that has regular outbreaks. It's cyclical, and it's only because of where it was that it was such a big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
So next question from Slido. We down to, okay, let's see. Let me just read here, because there's two questions with the same ranking here. Oh, I like this one because I've asked you guys this question before. Why can't we let nature take its course and leave the dead trees in Stanley Park as they are? So why, like some parks like Yellowstone, for example, they let fire go through, and Jasper let the beetle, go through, and they were faced with criticism when they let kind of nature takes its course. Is this something that could have been an option here in Stanley Park, just to say, like, you know what, this is nature, this is a native bug, it's doing its thing, let's just leave it. Would it have been an option?
Joe, do you want to tackle that one? I mean, I'm happy to talk.
I'll start. So I guess one of the first pieces of this is the city of Vancouver has a tree risk, an inspection policy, and we have legal and risk management obligations, right, in terms of public safety. City of Vancouver, a forest area in City of Vancouver is very different, obviously, than a forested area in more rural spaces. I guess if we were to have left all of the trees standing in the format they were, I think it would have been a very short time before we started seeing, not only partial tree failures, but also full tree failures, and just the structural degradation of those trees. It's happening fast, right? It's not just decay fungi that are affecting these trees. It's also the secondary insects like carpenter ants and ambrosia beetles that are impacting these trees, and then the birds like woodpeckers and whatnot that are coming and pulling the bark off. And so you see tops of these trees that are totally pitted out, ready to break off. And then the other piece of this is the primary risk assessment tool we use, which is the industry standard, is governed by the ISA, which is the tree risk assessment qualification. So we use the TRACK framework. And one of the primary pieces that affects the risk level is the occupancy rate, or how much time an area is occupied by people, right? Or anything that could be damaged by a tree. And unfortunately, Stanley Park, fortunately or unfortunately, much of that park is occupied. Some areas fairly consistently, other areas less so, but that's essentially the big driver in terms of what trees are getting treated. And as if you've been to Stanley Park lately, you'll notice that we're not removing every tree right at the ground. It's really, we're removing them at a height such that if it were to fail from the ground from, at that new height, it won't impact a highly used trail or a roadway or a path or a building. It's going to be standing dead wood, essentially, that will provide habitat for cavity nesters and whatnot. So I think we're trying to find that optimum point between, leaving enough coarse woody debris and standing woody debris in place, but also reducing the risk of failures that impact, relatively highly used spaces. But Bruce, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Joe, we did an interesting analysis right at the start where we took all the trail network, we took all the facilities, and we buffered them appropriately to meet the ISA standard. And of the 400 hectare area, we ended up with 5 hectares that we felt that maybe we could consider leaving the trees and not doing anything. So that's how many people, how much infrastructure, trails, roads, buildings, etc., are impacted by these dead trees if they're allowed to stand.
Good point.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, so one maybe last question. We're running out of time, unfortunately. There's still a lot of Slido questions, but maybe one, because it's the most highly voted one right now, and it's something that we've already addressed a little bit. But let me read it to you and see if we could just provide maybe just a short compliment to what you've already said. Question is, what lessons were learned with regard to public notification, education, to mitigate the negative discourse surrounding the necessary tree felling efforts? Either of you.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I've been through both processes, the Windthrow and this process. The wind throw, we had extensive consultation and some public meetings to discuss it. That probably delayed the cleanup by, I'm guessing, about 8 months. And there still was a lot of pushback. A lot of people didn't want the wind throw cleaned up. A lot of people wanted it left. This time around, there was urgency to get going, and there was a social media campaign. Global newspapers, etc., were given information. But within this environment of social media, there has been a small voice, and I'm going to say it's small, because when you talk to most people about what we're doing and how we're doing it, it's accepted for public safety that these trees need to come down. But that small voice got much more amplified because it was controversial. It wasn't necessarily the right voice. And I'm not convinced that public consultation that delayed the project 8 months would have made that voice go away across a social media platform. So what I've learned out of this is that social media is very powerful in promoting misinformation about what's really going on. And it's not always transparent. And it's hard to understand where these thoughts are coming from, and they're not necessarily based on science. So I have a lot of concern. I've learned a lot about social media in this kind of environment, about management, decision-making, and my counsel is don't believe everything you read.
Thanks for that, Bruce. Joe, anything quickly, because we kind of need to wrap up here, but if you have anything to say about this in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say, like, I think it's great that there are counter voices. You know, it holds us accountable in the roles and with the responsibilities that we've been tasked with. I think it's you know, that's critical. But sometimes I think, you know, media also have to take some ownership of the integrity of what they're putting out there through media channels to ensure that it's balanced and that there's a counterpoint to, you know, it may be, you might get likes and clicks on social media or you know, with media pieces, you know, with a controversial opinion, but I think it's important and that there should be an amount of due diligence from a media perspective to get a counterpoint. And I don't know that was always, you know, accounted for as we've been moving this project forward. And I just want to end by saying, like, at the end of the day, we have 100% faith that we're doing the right thing. We've dialogued with the, you know, the various entities that we should be, you know, working with, and collaborated closely with First Nations. And, you know, so far we have their support. And I think we have an open dialogue with them, you know, as we move forward. But I think it's, yeah, I think we've learned that, you know, it's important to have balance in what is being put out there on media, because it's, it can very quickly skew one way or the other. And at the end of the day, I'm the one left holding the bag.
Yeah, well, thanks you both for your thoughts. And there's still lots of questions on Slido. Unfortunately, we run out of time. We just only got a couple of minutes left. So I want to thank both of you, Bruce and Joe, for sharing your expertise for us today, for answering all these excellent questions. I think we kind of went into the depth here and left no stone unturned as far as I'm concerned. So you can turn off your cameras, Joe and Bruce. Thank you again while I do a couple of closing remarks. So thank you to all our viewers, and our UBC community and friends for joining us today. So if you're interested in learning more about the Faculty of Forestry, you can visit our website. If you like to revisit the conversation or show your UBC pride and share with others, the video of this webinar that we just did will be available for replay within the next week in the UBC Magazine website. And that's being shared right now in the chat. So you'll be receiving an email also when it's up and ready to view simply by sharing the impact of UBC alumni experts like your speakers today. We are having an impact on our world, and we are amplifying UBC's impact as well. So I would be remiss not to mention once again, forward the campaign from UBC for UBC, which is benefiting research, teaching, and learning across both campuses. And we are the catalyst to make that happen. So together we can shape a better world. We wish everyone well as we head into the summer break season. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a very passionate and informative webinar, and I enjoyed it very much. And thank you again, Joe and Bruce, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.